You ready to roll? Committee will come to order without objection. The chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. As a reminder, members participating in a hearing remotely should be visible on camera throughout the hearing. Members are responsible for controlling their own microphones. Members can be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise. As a reminder, statements, documents, motions must be submitted to the electronic repository to sccc.repository@mail.house.gov. Finally, members or witnesses experiencing technical problems should inform committee staff immediately. Well, thank you all for being here and joining this hybrid hearing on Climate Smart, from farm to fork, building an affordable and resilient food supply chain. Today we'll review pathways to create a sustainable, affordable food supply chain that is resilient in the face of climate change. We will examine opportunities for the food system to be a climate solution while also supporting human health and livelihoods. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Scorching temperatures and widespread disasters are putting lives at risk and harming communities across America. This week, families in Southwest Virginia were the latest to face deadly floods like those that swept through Yellowstone National Park just a few weeks ago. At the same time, there is too little water across much of the West, leading to frequent wildfires and dangerously low river and lake levels. In Texas, scorching hot temperatures almost stretched the grid to its limit, forcing families and industry alike to conserve electricity or risk a potential blackout. And Europe is facing what could be its worst heat wave in over 200 years. So it was very disappointing to learn that Senator Manchin is joining Republicans in rejecting investments to address this crisis. Investments that would reduce our dependence on expensive fossil fuels while helping to create jobs and cut dangerous heat-trapping pollution. The American people have consistently supported cleaner, cheaper energy like wind and solar. So while this is quite disappointing this morning, we must move forward and use all of the tools that we have to solve the climate crisis. The costs of inaction are too high, and climate injustice is too great, and our kids' futures are too precious. The climate crisis is also challenging our ability to put food on supermarket shelves and dining room tables across America. According to the American Farm Bureau Federation, major disasters left $12.5 billion in damages to crops and rangelands just last year. In North Dakota, persistent drought damaged over $2.4 billion worth of wheat, soybeans, corn, and other crops. Texas lost $2 billion in the aftermath of that weird winter storm, a hurricane, and other disasters. And extreme weather in California has led to the loss of about $500 million worth of fruit and nut crops. These impacts will worsen if we do not address them, and their costs are being passed on to consumers. And that's why Congress must invest in a climate smart food system that lowers cost, it increases food security, and incorporates solutions from farm to fork. Every person along the food chain, from producers to consumers to everyone in between, can make our food supply chain more sustainable. And each step in the supply chain represents an opportunity for innovation. That includes updating laws around food donation and labeling, strengthening sustainable school lunch programs, and increasing technical assistance for producers. It also includes supporting urban agriculture, improving food distribution at the local level, and working to reduce food waste and loss. Many of these solutions have an immediate impact. We can cut methane pollution by reducing food waste. We can drive down methane emissions from livestock by expanding the use of innovative feed additives like seaweed. And we can help farmers adopt proper regenerative grazing techniques that help the soil sequester more carbon. Moving quickly on these solutions will be crucial as we clean up the food supply system, which makes up nearly 30% of global heat-trapping pollution. And it will help us make progress on reducing biodiversity loss, deforestation, degraded soils, desertification, and water scarcity. With the support of President Biden, we've taken steps in the right direction. The American Rescue Plan included $3.6 billion to enhance food distribution, expand local and regional food systems, and support historically disadvantaged farmers. We also made progress through this year's government funding legislation, which invested in initiatives like the Urban Agriculture and Innovative Production Program and Farm-to-School grants. And finally, the Biden-Harris administration just announced a new framework to shore up the food supply chain, leveraging more than $2 billion in investments that will reduce pollution and make nutritious food more affordable for families. So as we move closer to the net zero economy, we have an opportunity to create a food system that works for Americans, ensuring access to safe, healthy food for generations to come. And we're going to get some good advice from our witnesses here today, and I look forward to that. At this time, I'll recognize Ranking Member Graves for his 5-minute opening statement. Welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The Chair and I both represent coastal communities on the Gulf of Mexico, and we absolutely share a strong desire to make sure that our communities are protected, that they're safe, they're sustainable. There's no division between us on that. However, the opening statement that was made connecting flooding in Virginia recently to climate change is a tenuous connection, and I think that the only way we're going to solve this problem is if we're sticking to science. And so let's talk a little bit about science. The United States could cut emissions today. We could cut every bit of emissions today, and it wouldn't have a single impact. It wouldn't have a single impact on any changes in weather patterns for 50 years, according to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the IPCC modeled maybe 75 years or maybe even 100 years. In fact, well, actually, I take that back. If we cut it in the United States, it wouldn't have an impact globally for probably in excess of 100 years. If the entire world cuts emissions, we're looking at 50, 75, or 100 years away before you would actually see changes in weather patterns if the models are accurate. And let me tell you something else that's really important for us to keep in mind that's also science-based. For every 1 ton of emissions that the United States has reduced over about the last 17 years, for every 1 ton we've reduced in the United States, China's increased by 4. It's a global environment. We're headed in the wrong direction. Even under the Paris Climate Accords, China gets to increase their emissions another 50% between now and 2030, despite the fact that today they're releasing more than the United States, the European Union, Japan, South Korea. Look, we can sit here and talk all day long about all these. We can sit here and say all these things and make people feel good. The truth is that the policies that are being pushed today by this administration are actually causing greater harm to the environment. We just saw inflation numbers come out this week at 9.1%, the highest number in over 40 years. We've seen gas prices double. We've seen natural gas prices nearly triple. We're pushing people into energy poverty, and we're having greater emissions as a result of this administration's strategy. You failed on affordability, you failed on emissions, and you failed on energy security. The President of the United States is in Saudi Arabia today in Saudi Arabia, asking that nation for more oil, choosing cartels, OPEC plus cartels, over my home state, Cajuns. I can keep having fun and say terrorist over Terrebonne, which is one of our parishes, but I'll stop with the rhyming and come back to reality. Look, we're talking about farms today. We're talking about farms to table. You know, fertilizer right now, we've seen a huge decrease in the availability of fertilizer. One of the largest inputs in fertilizer, natural gas. You're driving up cost for farmers. Since the 1950s, you've seen an efficiency in the United States increase in terms of our farm production, since the 1940s. By over 300%, we have the most efficient farming operations in the world in terms of emissions per bushels or acres of crops produced. We're looking right now at pushing 13.1 million people into a hunger crisis as a result of what's happening globally with Ukraine, with U.S. energy policies. But we're making it unaffordable to farm in the United States as a result of diesel prices going up and spiking, as a result of gasoline prices, the unavailability or unaffordability of fertilizer. This administration's energy policies are causing all of these problems. And the thing is there's a solution. The solution is, as we've shown, as science proves, more domestic energy production actually results in lower global emissions because we produce it safer with cleaner emissions than virtually anywhere else in the world. Just this week, we had a bill in the Natural Resources Committee right down that hallway where we're banning critical minerals production in the United States. Critical minerals like lithium, graphite, cobalt, nickel, copper, things that are required for renewable energy. You have to have these critical minerals. It's projected we're going to have a 400 to 600% increase in demand for those minerals. For graphite and lithium, a 4,000% increase. Look, we can't just wish this stuff to happen. We've got to have a cohesive strategy. This administration says no to oil and gas, despite it from the United States. Yes to Saudi Arabia and Iran and Venezuela. They say no to critical minerals that are needed for renewable energy. That's a none-of-the-above energy strategy that's failing the American people, it's failing the environment, and it's unfortunately failing our energy security and economic impacts as well. Yield back.
Now I want to welcome our witnesses. Thank you all for being here. We are very focused on how we improve this food supply chain to lower costs for consumers, so please keep that at the center of your testimony, along with the climate solutions, how we reduce the impacts of the climate crisis. Ms. Dana Gunders is the Executive Director of ReFed. Ms. Gunders leads ReFed's work to end food waste and loss across the U.S. food system. She authored a landmark 2012 report, Wasted, How America is Losing Up to 40% of Its Food from Farm to Fork to Landfill, and wrote the Waste-Free Kitchen Handbook. Gunders previously worked as a senior scientist with the National Resources Defense Council. Mr. Kent Swisher is the president and CEO of the North American Renderers Association. Mr. Swisher leads NARA's work to represent the rendering industry, which repurposes meat products that would otherwise be considered inedible, such as fat and bone. He is a member of the USDA's Trade Advisory Committee on Animals and Animal Products, and previously worked at the Continental Grain Company, U.S. Grains Council, and the American Seed Trade Association. Dr. Melinda Sepp is the Vice President for Natural Solutions and Working Lands at the National Audubon Society. Dr. Sepp works to advance natural climate solutions and conservation on working lands, such as rice fields, ranch lands, and forest. A trained veterinarian, she previously served as a senior advisor and deputy chief of staff at the United States Department of Agriculture. Ms. Ellie Brown is co-executive director of the San Diego Food Systems Alliance. Ms. Brown co-leads the Alliance's work to build a healthy and sustainable food system in San Diego County. Prior to joining the Alliance, Ms. Brown worked in nonprofit consulting at Root Causes and as an independent advisor to nonprofits, foundations, and social enterprises. Without objection, the witnesses' written statements will be made part of the record. With that, Ms. Gunders, you're now recognized to give a 5-minute presentation of your testimony. You are recognized.
Good morning. Thank you for that introduction. In addition to that, I'm also the mother of 2 children who last summer had 5 weeks of canceled camp and postponed school due to wildfires and smoke. My 7-year-old sometimes has trouble sleeping because she's afraid a fire will come during the night. Climate change is real and present in our lives, and I truly appreciate your action on the issue. I was asked to present the climate impacts of the entire food system and food waste. That's like covering all of energy and energy efficiency in 5 short minutes. Yet, unlike energy, food is an often overlooked and massive factor in the climate crisis. It produces 23 to 42% of total greenhouse gas emissions globally. Just the footprint of uneaten food is more than that of the entire aviation industry. And without interventions, that footprint is projected to increase by 1/3 by 2050. Beyond causing emissions, the food system is part of the solution. It also deeply is vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, with agricultural productivity already estimated to have declined 21% due to changes in climate. Given this critical role, one hearing on food is simply not enough, and I encourage a much deeper dive, perhaps even adding a food section to your congressional action plan. One often overlooked component of climate solutions is timing. Because greenhouse gases are cumulative, saving 1 ton of greenhouse gases annually is 10 times more valuable if it can start next year than if it starts 10 years from now. As one key climate leader said, time is more important than tech. New is good, but now is better. In contrast to other sectors, food solutions are available now. In addition, they are fundamental to addressing methane, whose short-term impacts make it critical to address sooner. And beyond just climate, improving our food system offers opportunities to address food insecurity, biodiversity loss, water scarcity, and even create jobs. In my written testimony, I go into more detail on 4 solution areas to consider. The first is encouraging a shift in diet away from animal products, which are the largest source of US methane. Beef in particular has by far the largest footprint. Just offering the Impossible Whopper, a meat alternative, allowed Burger King to save emissions equivalent to over 500 million passenger car miles in 1 year. Next, a move towards climate-friendly ag practices is a huge opportunity to both reduce emissions and sequester carbon in the soil. Third, protecting grasslands from being converted to cropland is critical, especially in this moment when rising food and fuel prices create additional incentives for farmers to expand into new land. Lastly, and my focus area, reducing food waste is an immediate strategy that inherently addresses all of the above-mentioned impacts. Imagine walking out of the grocery store with 3 bags, dropping one in the parking lot, and not bothering to pick it up. Seems crazy, but that is essentially what is happening across the country today. 35% of food in the US goes uneaten, over $400 billion worth. The average family of 4 spent almost $2,000 in 2019 on food they never ate. And just imagine how that dropped grocery bag must look to the 38 million food insecure Americans who could be fed 3 times over with the amount of food that's wasted. If all of our country's uneaten food was grown in one place, this mega farm would cover more land than Nebraska, Missouri, and Oklahoma combined, and use as much water as more than 50 million American homes. It would harvest enough food to fill a semi-truck every 20 seconds all year, but instead of being eaten, that food would go straight to a landfill where it would emit methane as it decomposed. In fact, food is the #1 contributor to landfills today, and landfills are the 3rd largest source of methane. All told, the climate impact of uneaten food in the US is equivalent to 58 million cars annually. Wasting less food increases supply, which makes food more affordable. Often people jump to solutions like composting, but preventing food waste is far more effective from a financial and a climate perspective. The good news is, unlike many of the thorny issues I'm sure you deal with, this one is solvable. We've seen momentum start to build with over 200 global food companies making commitments, companies including Kroger, General Mills, Compass Group successfully reporting reductions of 19 to 33%, and huge growth in private investment, including $2 billion in 2021 alone, more than double the previous year. Nevertheless, even with all this momentum, at best, we've reduced our food waste by only 2% per capita since 2016. The UK has achieved a 27% reduction in food waste. Some key steps to consider include funding a national awareness campaign to target consumers and a national public-private partnership to engage businesses, incentivizing local action through funding for state and local governments, increasing donation through adjustments to tax incentives and liability protections, and what I think is the lowest hanging fruit, standardizing food date labels to prevent consumers from discarding food prematurely. Wasting less food is something everyone can get behind, and in some cases, there is even money to be saved. The time to act is now. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for your testimony. Next, Mr. Swisher, you're now recognized for 5 minutes to give a summary of your testimony.
My apologies. Good morning, Chairwoman Castor, Ranking Member Graves, and members of the Select Committee. I'm Kent Swisher, President of the North America Renders Association. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. NARA is the trade association representing the interests of the rendering industry in the United States and Canada. NARA's 32 member companies operate 178 rendering plants and represent over 95% of the North American production. The industry includes independent renderers, many of which are multi-generation family-owned companies, as well as integrated packer renderers that process only their own animal byproducts. The rendering industry accounts for over $10 billion in U.S. economic activity and employs tens of thousands of people across the country in full-time jobs with benefits. Renderers have operations in both rural and urban communities. Rendering is the cooking and drying of meat and other animal byproducts not used for human consumption. Renderers are often referred to as the original recyclers and are a major force in ensuring a clean and healthy environment, upcycling the animal products that we do not want to or cannot eat into valuable proteins and fats for livestock feed, pet food, and industrial uses. The U.S. rendering industry is essential to the reduction of carbon emissions into the atmosphere. Americans consider only about 50 to 60% of an animal edible, which means the other 40 to 50% is deemed inedible. Instead of wasting about half the meat we produce, rendering upscales these leftovers into essential ingredients for countless new products. I would like to make 3 key points in my testimony today. First, the rendering industry is an essential pathway in creating a sustainable food system. Each year, renderers recycle a huge volume, more than 56 billion pounds of meat and bone leftovers. Rendering saves cropland. More than 13.6 million additional acres would have to be planted to make up for the protein and energy deficit that would result without rendered ingredients used in pet food, biofuels, and livestock feed. Rendering prevents alternative disposal methods which lead to unnecessary GHG emissions. In fact, an average rendering plant sequesters 5 times more greenhouse gas emissions from the environment than it emits. If not for rendering, the nationwide capacity of available landfill space would be full in only 4 years. And if the byproducts were disposed of in landfills during decomposition, they would emit large volumes of greenhouse gases detrimental to air quality, and runoff could threaten surface water quality. Rendering is important and a critical part of the solution to reducing food waste. It's a solution that directly addresses food waste by finding practical uses for a wide range of leftovers that consumers consider inedible. Rendering makes the food production footprint smaller. Second, renderers recycle billions of pounds of used cooking oil from food items like French fries into biodiesel and renewable diesel. Biodiesel and renewable diesel are important to reduce carbon emissions in the transportation sectors. In 2010, EPA concluded that biomass-based diesel produced from used cooking oil and other recycled waste greases reduced life cycle greenhouse gas emission by 86% compared to 2005 petroleum emissions. Finally, renderers have been collecting and repurposing animal byproducts for decades, transforming them into valuable new products. These products are used extensively as ingredients in livestock and aquaculture feeds and pet food. Rendered proteins and fats provide essential nutrients and energy to keep animal agriculture and pets healthy and growing. In addition, rendered protein meals are a source of calcium and phosphorus, which can be used in animal feeds and organic fertilizer, helping reduce the reliance on imported fertilizer. Renderers are early adopters of a resilient bio-based solution to reclaim and upcycle food waste. We are an essential element to the Select Committee's goal of achieving substantial and permanent reductions in pollution and other activities that contribute to climate crisis. NARA supports a level playing field among recyclers to prevent unfair market advantage and unequal competition for animal byproducts. Renderers understand the need to fairly compete for raw material inputs, but not against companies receiving government financial incentives, providing them with added advantage. Federal support should not divert leftover meat and bones and other animal byproducts from traditional renderers to other recyclers. In closing, NARA looks forward to being a part of the discussion as your committee considers future legislative initiatives. We would appreciate your recognition of the important role of rendering in sustainability and reducing carbon emissions. The rendering industry respectfully recommends that any legislative effort adequately recognize the early leaders in GHG reduction in order to avoid unintended consequences in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Swisher. Dr. Sepp, you're now recognized for 5 minutes to provide a summary of your testimony. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm honored to testify this morning on behalf of the National Audubon Society, representing more than 1.8 million members together with 45 million Americans who enjoy birdwatching. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss how we can mitigate climate change and support biodiversity on working lands while building a resilient supply chain. I would like to start by telling you about a visit to the Dakotas. I was meeting with ranchers, and one of them told me he knew the conservation plan that had been developed through our Conservation Ranching Initiative was working. He knew because his 90-year-old father, who still lived on the ranch, told him that the front pasture sounded like it had when he was a kid, because long absent birds had returned. And he knew that a healthy grassland landscape, once again teeming with birds, was a sign of its improved productivity for grazing. I could explain our bird survey results or share a lot of statistics with you this morning, but I think that stories like that demonstrate the impact of Audubon's partnership with farming, ranching, forestry, and fishing families across America. They know intuitively that birds are indicators of the health of the places that they love. So just the way they track the amount of grass during a drought or the water level during a rainy season, they talk about bird songs as the sound of success. They know from experience what scientists have proven, that their livelihoods are intertwined with biodiversity and climate change. Global experts have concluded that one of the most important available actions we can take is implementation of sustainable agriculture and forestry practices. Doing so would increase carbon stores, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, support wildlife habitat, and improve our capacity to adapt to climate change. People who farm, ranch, fish, and produce timber feel the effects of climate change firsthand. From 1980 through 2016, weather and climate disasters with losses of $1 billion or more averaged 6.3 events per year. But for the last 5 years, that has nearly tripled to 17.8. We think of the wildfires in California, Oregon, Washington, and Colorado, the hailstorms in Texas, the flooding in Louisiana, the hurricanes, tropical storms, and tornadoes in Florida and all around the Southeast, the derechos in the Midwest, and the droughts and heat waves in the West. That list is not the last 5 years. Those were all last year. That escalation happened alongside the accelerating loss of biodiversity. North America today has only 2/3 of the wildlife it had in the 1970s. 2/3. Wild bird populations have likewise plummeted by 30%. But the good news is that not every bird has suffered that fate. Species that communities and governments have committed to protecting through financial investments and legislative safeguards have rebounded. I believe that the success stories shared in my written testimony demonstrate how climate-smart agriculture and forestry can support biodiversity, resilient supply chains, and other important outcomes like water quality and quantity. Those stories, the sharp-tailed grouse, which thrives in grasslands that are sustainably grazed and also store carbon and water, the swamp candle, which nests in bottomland hardwood forests that soak up floodwater and improve water quality, and the tricolored blackbird, adapting to habitat loss by nesting in forage fields at dairy farms, lift up the many benefits of optimizing working lands to support carbon storage, wildlife habitat, food production, water, and more. Audubon believes that such conservation must be and can be beneficial for all, including private landowners across the country and consumers. We recognize that different solutions are needed in different places, and we work to support durable conservation across communities and landscapes. The conservation, forestry, research, and extension policies and programs authorized in the Farm Bill are important to delivering those promises. But there is significant more interest in these programs than there is capacity. For example, 46% of valid applications for a single federal conservation program went unfunded, meaning producers submitted and were interested in implementing $1.1 billion worth of voluntary conservation proposals above and beyond what the program could deliver in just 1 year. We can and should expand these programs while also promoting the marketplace, private sector investments, and innovative partnerships like the ones in my written testimony. Such work is only part of what is needed to stem the tide of climate change and biodiversity loss. If we can scale up these programs to meet their demand, we can work together to improve climate, biodiversity, and water outcomes while simultaneously supporting a resilient supply chain and thriving communities. We do not face a zero-sum scenario. These goals are not in conflict with one another. Thank you for the opportunity today, and I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Sepp. Next, Ms. Brown, you are recognized for 5 minutes to provide a summary of your testimony.
Thank you. Chair Castor, Ranking Member Graves, and members of the Select Committee, thank you so much for the invitation today. I'm Ellie Brown, Co-Executive Director of San Diego Food System Alliance. We are a diverse and inclusive network in the San Diego region committed to cultivating an equitable and sustainable food system. And most recently, we launched a 10-year plan and movement, San Diego County Food Vision 2030, with the understanding that the time to reimagine and reconfigure our food system is now, and change must take root at the community level. Food Vision 2030 was created through a 2-year participatory process, including over 250 organizations and 3,000 individuals, primarily individuals that are most marginalized by our dominant system: low-income residents, tribal communities, farmers, fishermen, food and farm workers, immigrant-owned food businesses. And Food Vision 2030 outlines a set of objectives to achieve 3 goals: cultivate justice, fight climate change, build resilience. For cultivating justice, access to resources connected to our food system are divided along racial lines, whether it's access to healthy food, access to capital, land, housing, business ownership, due to history and continued inequities. Second, fighting climate change. As Dana pointed out, the truth is our industrialized dominant food system is the biggest culprit to the climate crisis. And at the same time, a localized food system that regenerates and recirculates resources is the most natural way to go and truly is an impactful solution. Third, building resilience. The pandemic has truly disrupted the food system, increase in food insecurity, business impacts. We have small-scale food producers in our region, small farmers and fishermen, small local food businesses that really struggle to survive every single day. We need to do a better job of creating better safety nets for communities and more nimble systems that can really tap into these local assets that we have and not reliant on the larger industrialized system that is just not nimble enough. As we look beyond the impact of the pandemic, there's a significant opportunity to invest in a more localized food system and increase the amount of local food that is retained in our region, creating a multiplier effect. According to a 2019 analysis by the San Diego Regional EDC, food system activities in our region generate over $35 billion in economic output and account for 15% of jobs in the region, representing a major contribution to the regional economy. So my request for the federal government, 2 really big ideas, but very necessary. 1, shifting power of the food system to community governance, to bioregional community governance. The current racial and climate inequities of the food system can directly be contributed to where power resides. We must shift power away from top-down control to local community governance and bioregions, a region that's defined by the characteristic of the natural environment rather than man-made. We need to center equity and values in our governance and allow for there to be adaptability for each food shed. Food shed is a term that's defined by the food resources in a particular bioregion. Second, simultaneously, the second ask is to resource, fund nimbly, and humanize the processes. Resources from the U.S. government rarely move nimbly to support community food projects led by communities. We need to remove burdensome barriers around permitting, applications, monitoring, compliance, and reporting if we are to truly create a supportive environment and resource impactful projects in the ground. Climate dollars, even if accessible, come with too many strings attached around monitoring and reporting. We need to build resource funding mechanisms, which include both trust and accountability. Currently, the system feels off balance, placing way too much emphasis on accountability mechanisms that is excessive and unrealistic. We need to humanize, simplify, and streamline if we are truly to meet the climate and equity goals. I wanted to end with the emphasis that really our goal should not be to fix our supply chain or fix our broken food system. It should be to transform it completely by confronting the injustices that underpin it and redistributing power across communities. And yes, it is a multi-generational effort. Our federal government is one of the most important stakeholders in this transformation, and I encourage all of us to approach this issue with open minds and creativity. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Ms. Brown, and thanks to all of our witnesses for your insightful and informative testimony. Now we'll move to member questions, and I'm going to recognize Mr. Caston of Illinois first for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to all our witnesses. You know what, this committee's been around for about 4 years, and it makes me sad that after 4 years, many of our same membership, we continue to tell stories that are about trying to score political points and calling it science. Our ranking member led off by criticizing the president for going to Saudi Arabia. A little while ago, you criticized the president for tapping into the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Both of those are to increase supply, to cut the cost of energy, for our farmers, to cut the cost of natural gas so that our fertilizer costs will go down. And I don't recall any noise when Donald Trump went to the Saudis and said, I'm going to remove the military from your country unless you cut down on oil production so that we can increase the cost of oil, so that we can save our oil industry. Price of oil went up double digits the next day. Crickets. You do an admirable job of representing your district, Mr. Graves. You do an admirable job of repeating the talking points of your party. Your district depends on exporting fossil fuel. Our fossil fuel industry is trying to sell and produce as much fuel as they can because they want access to European markets. That doesn't make them bad people, it makes them profit-seeking businesses. We just saw an example of that when that LNG terminal in Maine caught fire and the domestic price of gas fell. So what are we going to do for the people who matter? How are we going to actually lower costs? We're going to do it by decoupling from fossil fuel, by not being beholden to Vladimir Putin. We're not going to do it by scoring cheap talking points. So let's talk about the actual science here. If we are going to give a stable planet to our kids, to not have your kids staying home from school as a result of a wildfire, we have to not only stop emitting fossil fuel, we have to go backwards. We have to get back to 300 and 350 parts per million in the atmosphere. In order to do that, the only ways that I have seen that actually profitably take CO2 out of the atmosphere are in the agricultural sector. We can put, direct air capture in, but we're going to have to pay a lot of money for those. And so, Dr. Sepp, I'd like to start with you. As you think about what tools we have, we hear a lot about approaches from biochar to short rotation grazing to cover crops. What are the ways that we can actually increase the wealth for our farmers that would reduce as much CO2 from the atmosphere as possible? Because we are out of time for politicking and we've got to start doing these things today. So if you were queen, what are the areas you'd like to see in the agriculture sector that we really focus on pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere as quickly as possible that makes sense for our farmers?
Great question. Thank you, Congressman. I'd like to, if I can, kind of talk a little bit about the structure that's needed to implement the practices in addition to the practices themselves. And I just want to underscore so much of the type of conservation work and the type of sustainable practices that need to be implemented in the field at scale, not just kind of isolated, requires substantial technical assistance as you're learning to implement them. And frankly, right, like every field is different, every forest tract is different. So part of that really relies on having a strong technical delivery service and system. So whether that's the Natural Resources Conservation Service, the technical assistance funding and the staffing capacity that they have, state agencies, partners, including Audubon staff. We have rangeland ecologists out in the field helping develop management plans and conservation plans. We have certified foresters on staff. So it's both about supporting the practice implementation, but also supporting the technical assistance so that local solutions and what works best for specific soil types and specific microclimates that folks are producing in is really able to be delivered.
We've had, and I know I'm tight on time, we've got a program in Illinois where we've been paying farmers, allow them to reduce their crop insurance payments for every acre they put into cover crops. We've got a program to try to do that nationally. Do you have any thoughts and comments on that and how broadly applicable that might be for the country?
Sure. So I'm happy to follow up with you and your staff on that specific bill. I'll admit just, another anecdote. I'm from the Eastern Shore of Maryland. Maryland has a really great state cover crop program that, again, was intended to, that one was developed with an eye to the Chesapeake Bay health and really resulted in a substantial adoption of cover crops at a voluntary level across private working lands across the state. And there's certainly different models and different ways to work to scale that, so I'm happy to work with your office on that specific bill. But I think that creative solutions to make it financially feasible for producers to implement those practices across landscapes, not just in individual fields, is what's needed.
Okay, I'm out of time. Thank you very much. And if anybody does have further comments with our office, I'd also be interested in thoughts on short rotation grazing and what that might do to improve soil health, but that's a longer conversation of time. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Representative Miller, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Good morning.
Thank you, Chair Castor. Thank you, Ranking Member Graves, for having this today. I don't think anyone on this committee denies climate change. Our world has been changing ever since it was created, and we now have the science in order to deal with it, and we are learning every day what we can do to change it. And Chair Castor, I appreciate your concern over the flooding in southern West Virginia and Virginia, and recognizing the unique phenomenon that we have, that often when it rains too much, because of our mountainous terrain, it has to go somewhere, and when there's too much rain, it goes down. My community in Huntington had a flash flood because there were 4 inches of rain that hit somewhere else, and boom, there it was. And you know, my friends had 9 feet of water in their basements. So I think what we need to do is work together on proactive solutions that fit our individual communities instead of trying one-size-fits-all mandates. I'm a bison farmer, and I've owned Swan Ridge Bison Farm near Milton, West Virginia for the past 28 years. I'm also a member of the Farm Bureau. I understand things like episodic hemorrhagic disease, which occurs during droughts. I understand that sometimes the government does make suggestions or policies that end up not working, like multiflora rose as a living fence, which then became a nightmare later for farmers because they were fighting those multiflora roses all through their cropland. And I understand the lack of meat processing plants. I'm acutely aware of the struggles that our farmers and our ranchers face bringing their goods to the market. They often operate on such thin margins just trying to make a living, but they work hard. And I've seen bad years where they face when the harvest isn't particularly good, and I've seen it when herds succumb to disease. As a farmer and a rancher, these things happen, and they're often out of our control. But there are some crises that we can play a role in fixing. Unfortunately, those bad policy decisions that have pushed inflation and gas prices and diesel prices to record high. Just this week, we learned that inflation last month was at 9.1%, the highest in 40 years. For our food supply chains to thrive, it must first have the resources to do so. That means ensuring that we're making it easier to hire drivers to fix the worsening trucker shortage, lowering fuel costs for both transportation and farm work, and producing more fertilizer here in the United States. It also means not allowing the liberal activists to dictate our energy and agriculture policies, but instead, why don't we listen and take some common sense approach that balances the needs of our people with conserving our country for future generations? Unfortunately, many of the people that live on both coasts, where there's just so much population, they don't understand that it really is flyover country that not only feeds you, but it heats you. Mr. Swisher, as a bison farmer myself, I'm aware of how important it is to make full use of the herd that we raise on our lands. Those who lived on the lands before us knew that they had to use every part of the animals they hunted in order to survive. And that's why I have such respect for your industry. In your testimony, you mentioned the high-tech process that some rendering techniques use. Can you explain the supply chain crisis that we're facing today and how it's impacted your industry, and whether that through deliveries or equipment shortages?
Thank you, Congresswoman. Yes, the supply chain crisis has affected us in multiple ways. In one way, on our shipping of our products, so exporting our proteins, and we're highly dependent on the export market. We fill containers and ship product on containers, and of course you all know that there was a major issue getting containers to our plants, and containers were going back to Asia empty when we have product to put in those containers. On the other side, we move a lot of raw material into our plants. We have a huge trucking fleet. We have pickups at every grocery store you see. We probably have a truck going there picking up expired meat. Every restaurant, even up here on Capitol Hill, will have a vat behind the restaurant that used cooking oil goes, and our trucks pick up used cooking oil. So the cost of fuel, any disruptions in the supply chain affects our business on both ends.
Can you explain a little bit how the rendering industry actually uses all the food that isn't consumed, and what they do, and what are some of the top products that you create?
And I think we'll have to take that question for the record.
Thank you. I yield
We're going to
back
stay
my
on.
time.
Thank you very much. Ms. Bonamici, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Castor and Ranking Member Graves. Thank you to our witnesses. The food supply chain is both contributing to and being harmed by rising emissions and climate change. In a 2021 report, the UN's Food and Agricultural Organization found that the food supply chain accounts for as much as 30% of human-caused greenhouse gas emissions. Last year, the Northwest cherry growers, including my home state of Oregon, they represent Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana, and Utah. They estimated that the heat dome event of last June and July resulted in the loss of about 20% of the state's cherry crop. That's equivalent to 4 million pound boxes that never went to market. I also want to recognize the passing of Sebastian Francisco Perez, a 38-year-old farm worker who died last year during the 115-degree heat wave in Oregon. We must make our food supply chains more climate change resistant and resilient, but also mitigate the role that they play in fueling emissions, creating unnecessary waste, and straining our natural resources. So in Portland, Neutral Foods is a small business producing carbon neutral milk. They purchase verified carbon offsets and work with dairy farmers to reduce their overall carbon footprint through changes to grazing, manure, and nutrient management. They recently applied for a USDA Climate Smart Commodities grant to expand their important work to tackle emissions from beef production. So I want to ask Ms. Brown, how can the federal government help small businesses and nonprofits that are seeking to address emissions in the agricultural sector to more effectively be able to access federal grants, and which federal programs have been most helpful in allowing you to meet your organization's goals?
Thank you for the question. My second ask was really to conduct a comprehensive effort to examine how government can streamline and humanize these processes so they're a lot more accessible. Currently, it is just not accessible unless you have trusted technical assistance facilitators in the region to support with accessing these resources for farmers, low-income communities, grassroots groups. For us, USDA Regional Food System Partnership was an interesting example which allowed us to create a new program that will help support us being the facilitator of further resources to support our communities. And another example that I wanted to highlight is recently our partner, Food Shed, which is a small food farm aggregation hub in San Diego County, has taken on a leadership challenge to apply for a $5 million federal grant for a carbon sink incentive fund pilot. And they have really smart people in that team that has experience in grant writing. And they have been complaining of how cumbersome that process is. Finding matching funds is pretty much nearly impossible. And most farming groups do not have professional grant writers on the team.
Right.
So
thank you. That's really helpful. In fact, I just met with a vineyard owner in Oregon recently. They used some federal assistance to transform their energy and now have almost all their energy coming from solar panels, and it's going to pay for itself in just a few years. I have a question for Ms. Gunders. In your testimony, you outlined a number of bills that have been introduced and, if enacted, would address food waste challenges. What food waste-related issues have not received sufficient attention from Congress?
Well, I think the ones that are starting to receive more attention are the extension of liability protections for food donation. There's been quite a lot of attention towards food donation lately. What's not receiving attention is how to prevent the food from going to waste in the first place. That whenever food is wasted, there's money wasted with it. So things like how much food is being wasted in food that is purchased by the federal government. Any sort of measurement techniques to understand how much does the Department of Defense, a huge purchaser of food, actually wind up throwing out, and all of the cost of that with it. So that's been something that has not received very much attention lately at all, or ever.
I appreciate that, and I think it's important to note that in many places in this country we have significant amounts of food insecurity, and we can do a much better job of aligning the food waste issues and addressing the serious problem of hunger in our communities. And I'm going to yield back the few seconds I have remaining. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Next, we'll go to Mr. Levin. You are recognized for 5 minutes. Oh, excuse me. My fault. Mr. Palmer, good morning. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. On the food waste, I'd just like to point out that a lot of food waste in our country is in our public schools, and a direct result of government food programs that began with the Obama administration. After Michelle Obama's nutrition program went into effect, there were over 1 million, almost 1.1 million school kids just quit eating school lunches altogether. And it's now estimated that roughly somewhere between 30 and 50% of all food in the public school systems is thrown away. So I think that needs to be part of the discussion. I'm also, it's interesting to me how, and both sides are guilty of this, of politicizing this, but the facts are the facts. And if it weren't for fossil fuel, we would have hundreds of millions of people malnourished and possibly starving to death. But the fact of the matter is, since we've introduced modern farming techniques that are fueled with fossil fuels, machinery like tractors, harvesters, planters, transportation vehicles, processing equipment, refrigeration, I mean, these are all things that are byproducts of the fossil fuel industry. Even though the world population has doubled, you can't see this, but the number of people who are dying from starvation has gone down, like a sinking ship. That's a good thing. And what we found is that when you introduce these policies that are being advocated for how we produce food and how we provide energy, it can have catastrophic results. Just look at Sri Lanka. You've got people marching on the government capital because in Sri Lanka and the Netherlands, we've just seen this, of the dire crisis that government mandates create. Poor attempts at environmental policy through government-mandated chemical fertilizer bans in Sri Lanka created a food price spike and economic peril that the people are suffering through right now. The country's on the verge of collapse. I mean, you got to think about the unintended consequences. My colleague mentioned someone who died from heat exposure, and I keep pointing this out, and they don't like for me to point it out. But Lancet, other medical journals in the world have made it clear that there's 17 times or more people die from cold-related issues than heat. I grew up dirt poor. We grew most of our own food. I'm thankful that my grandpa had a tractor. I'm thankful that we had a freezer and a refrigerator. I'm thankful that there were places that we could go that utilized modern techniques to process some of the food that we produced. I just don't understand why we want to go so headlong into adopting policies that are clearly going to have a very negative impact on people's lives. That's astounding to me. It's almost like we have people who think that we need to enforce some form of population control and that might include starvation. I'm not accusing anybody of that. I'm just saying that what's happening in Sri Lanka is, I think, evidence of going too far, too fast. Mr. Swisher, I appreciate the work that you're doing. I just wonder if in your efforts in food rendering and the work that you're doing, if you've contacted the public school systems to get access to the food that's going out in the trash cans every day.
Thank you. We have, as I said earlier, networks of trucks that go to restaurants, and that would include schools. But we pick up meat scraps. So the meat scraps from any commercial establishment or restaurant would be a place that we would visit and recycle that material.
I don't think they're throwing out the meat. I think it's the other stuff. With that, I'll yield back.
Next, Mr. Levin, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Castor. You know, today is a tough day for those of us that want to see climate action commensurate with what science demands. But make no mistake, to those who demand action, particularly the next generation, we see you, we hear you, and we will not stop until the actions that we need are taken. Now onto the topic of today's hearing. I'm particularly glad that the Select Committee gets the opportunity to hear from Ellie Brown, Co-Executive Director of the San Diego Food System Alliance. San Diego Food System Alliance is a visionary organization in our region, fostering collaboration across all aspects of our food system in order to build a more sustainable, healthy, and fair food system. San Diego County Food Vision 2030, which the Alliance developed over 2 years and created in collaboration with our community, is a testament to that vision. Food Vision 2030 provides a 10-year roadmap for a food system that enhances the vitality of our local communities, protects our environment, and creates additional economic opportunities within our county. For those who don't know, San Diego County is home to a robust food system. Across the county, food system activities generate over $35 billion in economic output and account for 15% of all jobs in the region. However, our local food system faces a myriad of challenges, from high operating costs to entrenched systems of inequality to a climate crisis that exacerbates water scarcity and other environmental stressors. With this context, let me start off with a basic but important question for Ms. Brown. Given all the challenges farmers and other producers in our region face, why is a strong local food economy and agricultural sector key to San Diego's success?
Thank you, Congressman Levin. It's an honor to be here to represent San Diego and our work in our region. As I mentioned, $35 billion in economic output. That is significant. Majority of the food that's produced in our region, small farms, small fisheries, most of this food is exported. During the pandemic, the entire supply chain shut down, and many of us really had to step up to support our local food producers. So imagine if we can create a more just food system for our local food producers, and one that really looks at the environment and one that really looks at equity. There's a significant opportunity here, and keeping things localized can help us build more human relationships and really address that pain that everybody is talking about in the need for transition to one that where we are really looking at the economy from many different ways. So I love the local work because it allows us to have real relationships and understand the needs on the ground and the realities on the ground of these farmers, fishermen, food businesses.
Thank you for that answer. How can investing in local food systems help communities, especially underserved communities, become more resilient to the impacts of climate change like drought and water scarcity?
Yeah, well, in terms of communities, there's a lot of issues. Food insecurity, these communities are at the front lines of climate change impacts. So we need to address the issues, the symptoms first, the current inequities through all tools available by government, public assistance, grants, local incentives to try to flow more resources into communities and towards a healthy local food economy. And I speak specifically from the food system lens because that's the work that I'm in. But at the same time, we also really need to address the root, and that these issues were not just created through the food system. It was through the history of injustices, of the dominant economic system, and we need to resist review power. I wanted to provide a quote, as Francis Moore Lape put, People do not go hungry from a lack of food, but rather from a lack of power. Power to access food and power to access land to grow food.
I was also impressed by your local food economy lab and excited to hear about the USDA grant that you received. Can you expand on your vision for this lab and explain why building capacity at the local level is a key element of strengthening and increasing the resilience of our regional food system?
Yes, this new program through the Regional Food System Partnership Grant, we've just co-created this program, the Local Food Economy Lab, with the beneficiaries, farmers, fishermen, and food businesses in our region in terms of what they were looking for. And the program is now a pretty robust program, which includes peer mentoring, customized support services, as well as financial support for these businesses. And we intend to work with an ecosystem of technical assistance providers in this region. The intention is to really support the viability of these businesses and to treat it as sort of an experiment that we're observing over time in terms of how we're doing, setting ourselves accountable in terms of the goals that we want to see, and also to supporting with models that are different type of economic models that will help build community wealth, cooperatives, worker-owned businesses. These businesses, it's just not a common thing here in the United States. So we want to see how we can make these businesses viable in our region.
Thank you again. I'm out of time, but thank you for your work on behalf of all of San Diego County. And Cheryl, yield back.
Mr. Carter, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank all the witnesses for being here. And I want to say right off that I really appreciate the fact that we're having this hearing about rural America. A big part of my district is rural, a lot of ag, a lot of forestry, and this is important because just as I don't feel like the United States gets the credit for the decrease in carbon emissions that we have achieved over the years, I don't think our farmers, I don't think our foresters get the credit that they deserve for what they've done with sustainable forests, serving as carbon sinks. Our farmers who are producing more food, more fiber, more feed and renewable fuels without many using more resources. The United States farmer feeds the world. And here we are trying to criticize them for carbon emissions. It just baffles me. I want to read you a couple of things here. First of all, agriculture productivity in the U.S. increased 287% from 1948 to 2017. American farmers now require 40 million fewer acres, or 33% fewer acres in 2018 to produce the same amount of corn it would have had to in 1990. 4 million fewer, or 27% fewer for cotton. And you know, perhaps the most attacked part of farming, of agriculture, is livestock. But they continue to reduce their emissions. Emissions per unit of beef production have declined 8% since 1990, 18% unit of pork, and 25% unit of milk. Even the Secretary of Agriculture, appointed by President Biden, the Democratic Secretary of Agriculture, said, and I quote, "I do not think we have to reduce the amount of meat our livestock produce in the U.S., and a significant percentage is exported. It's not a question of eating more or less or producing more or less. The question is making production more sustainable," end quote. That's the Secretary of Agriculture. The Democratic Secretary of Agriculture said that. American farmers are part of the solution. They are not part of the problem. Mr. Swisher, I appreciate you being here, and I want to start by saying that one of your members is located in my district in Alma, Georgia, in Bacon County. I've visited there often and am quite impressed with the work that they're doing there. But when I was listening to your testimony on the magnitude of animal byproducts that are recycled every day across the U.S., it reminds me of the critical role that renderers play in the sustainability of animal production systems by utilizing nearly all of the byproducts, almost all of the byproducts from the production of meat. And in addition to preventing waste, they're also providing sustainability produced inputs of multiple of consumer products we use each and every day. So let me ask you, can you talk about some of the key inputs that renderers provide for the supply chain that would not exist without your industry?
Yes, thank you. We produce meals and fats and oils. So one really positive success story that we have is that we replace fish meal in aquatic rations. So over time, fish meal production has been flat. Since the 80s, it hasn't increased. And aquaculture production has skyrocketed. And so because we're an animal protein, we fit in those rations much better because of our amino acid complex and things like that. So we're replacing fish meal on a global level in Indonesia and other countries as well. And then our fats and oils, back in the early 1800s, we produced candles and things out of beef tallow. And those markets have changed over time, and now we're producing more renewable diesel and biofuel as a complement to the liquid fuel.
Well, let me ask you this. Earlier, one of the other witnesses indicated that most of our landfills were animal products. Do your members, are they filling up the landfills, or are they recycling byproducts?
We're recycling byproducts. We're keeping the raw material from going to landfills, and we're producing things like meals and fertilizers and fuels. And
that's the one thing that bothers me about this committee. If I could, Madam Chair, just please indulge me. The whole cycle. You got to look at the whole cycle. You cannot look at just one part of it. This is the whole cycle, and recycling the byproducts is part of the cycle. Thank you, and I yield back.
Next, Ms. Brownlee, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks for holding this hearing. I've been looking forward to it. So my first question goes to Ms. Gunders. Food waste is a very large contributor, as we know, to greenhouse gas emissions. And as you've said, there are bills in Congress to address a myriad of labeling confusion. Can you speak to the labeling issue and its contribution to food waste and climate change?
Absolutely. Thank you. And first, I'd like to clarify that I actually did not say animal products were filling up landfills, but food scraps overall, all types of food, are the #1 product entering landfills today. On your question for date labels, yes. So the use by, best by, sell by, enjoy by, the many words that you see to describe the dates on food are actually quite confusing to consumers, and consumers are misinterpreting those dates to mean that they are supposed to throw the food out. So about 86% of consumers are somewhat confused around the dates and are therefore throwing food away prematurely. There is no federal regulation for these dates. Consumers in manufacturers can put whatever they want onto the product. The solution that we see is to standardize the food date labels, to have 2 phrases, one that is about quality and one that is about safety, and to require only those 2 phrases be used as a way to create actual definitions and be able to communicate with certainty to consumers and reduce confusion out there. There is a bill that is currently introduced in this Congress to create that standardization. There is an industry voluntary agreement, and much of the industry is actually behind this change, including companies like Unilever.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And staying on the same subject of labeling, what impact do you think labeling restrictions on alternative proteins, milks, and cheeses may have on their adoption, and how important is adoption to combating climate change?
Yes, well, my understanding of the alternative protein realm is quite limited, but I understand that there are some labeling issues that, that they would like to be able to call things like almond milk. They would like to be able to call that milk still. I think that, there's no single bullet, but offering alternative products that are similar to animal products is one of the tools in the toolkit to having us reduce our overall consumption of meat as we look forward. And I think it's important to note that Food demand is predicted to increase quite a bit. By the UN predicts we'll need about 50% more food by 2050 to feed our global population than we do today. So I think when we're talking about reducing consumption, it's not necessarily reducing production, but rather trying to freeze the footprint of food at what it is today in order to feed a growing population and a growing demand.
Thank you. And staying on the same theme, Ms. Sepp, so recently in grocery stores, I've noticed that some food producers have begun to label their foods as carbon neutral. Do you believe creating a uniform climate-friendly labeling standard would help address climate impacts of food production and incentivize consumers to choose more climate-friendly alternatives, just similar to calorie labeling and nutrition labeling?
Thank you for the question. So I think more generally, market-based conservation programs have the potential to diversify income opportunities for producers, which is great, and provide us a signal from the marketplace to support durable, on-the-ground conservation of climate-smart, like adoption and large-scale adoption in particular of climate-smart practices. I think that there are certainly a wealth of different ways of approaching front of package labeling and doing so in a way that is consistent, fair, and transparent for consumers, and also reflects the science of the practices and the outcomes in the field. And balancing that so that it's accessible for consumers in the marketplace is certainly is needed, but those signals do have the potential to really help support large-scale adoption of the practices, which is what we've talked about today as really being needed to realize the natural solutions potential of working lands.
Thank you with that, and I will yield back. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Representative Graves, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I want to respond to some comments that were made earlier. First of all, comments were made that President Trump asked Saudi Arabia to cut oil production. I read the same reports, and that was in April of 2020, and I want to make note that oil prices at the time were actually in the negative range. They were in the negative range. So if we're going to sit here and we're going to talk about oil prices, let's do that. Except for maybe I won't do it. Yeah. Can you come hold these for me, Huffman? So look at what's happened with gas prices. This is during the Biden administration. So we were talking about prices. My friend was talking about prices when they were negative. Literally, the oil futures were negative. And so, yes, he did go to the cartel and ask them to cut production so we could continue to have energy production in the United States. And here's why. We have some of the lowest emissions in the world for units of energy produced here. Why would you want to kill that industry? So this is what's happened during this administration. So to suggest that there were issues with that conversation, fascinating. Now, look, I don't have a crystal ball. As Mr. Huffman will tell you, I'm not even very smart, but this was January 27th of 2021. Okay, last year, January of last year, I could recognize what was going to happen with energy prices. And I said then, as a result of the executive orders and the other actions the Biden administration was taking, we're going to have higher electricity bills, higher prices at the gas pump, lost revenue sharing for hurricane protection, flood control, and coastal restoration in my home state of Louisiana, Alabama, Texas, Mississippi, and others, higher delivery costs for products being delivered all across the United States, more dependence on foreign energy from China, Russia, and Iran and other countries, a net increase in global emissions as a result of getting energy from other countries and offshoring services. Got to tell you, that's batting 1,000. That's better than I ever did in college. So, I don't think that this stuff is really rocket science here. In fact, it's so much not rocket science, you can make a cartoon off of what's happening right now, as somebody apparently did. President Biden saying, we don't want to pollute the air with our fossil fuels, so then he's going to Saudi and saying, can we use yours? It's exactly what's happening right now. This is completely baffling to me that, that's what we have going on. That's what we have going on. Now, last thing is this right here. This is a letter from Senator Cantwell, Senator Menendez, Senator Markey, and Senator Schumer. Just read this one. The current run-up in world oil prices is effectively a tax on every American family's discretionary budget, except that the money goes to the OPEC cartel rather than the U.S. Treasury. Couldn't agree with them more. I want to highlight this word tax, because when you go back and you look at, at this one right here, that's a tax. The President of the United States said that no one making less than $400,000 was going to get a tax. Cantwell, Schumer, Menendez, and somebody else. Markey, thanks. And Markey said that's a tax. That's a tax. Every American's paying it. It's pushing people into energy poverty. People have the false choice of deciding if they're going to if they're going to pay their electricity bill, fuel their car, or get groceries. This is unbelievable, and I'm going to say it again, it's resulting in higher emissions. I want to ask, I believe you, Dr. When you carry out better farming practices, as you noted, I assume that results in sequestered greenhouse gases, improved sequestration of greenhouse gases. Is that accurate? Or potentially?
Sorry, yes, sir. The hope, right, is that by implementing sustainable practices, you are storing more carbon in the soil, you're improving the water infiltration rate, right? Like, and the list of co-benefits goes on. It's also improved habitat potential for wildlife, yes.
Thank you. I didn't mean to go off on a diatribe, and I just kind of ate all of my time. So I know, I didn't have much coffee today, but I'm gonna yield back. I'm gonna submit some questions for the record, because I do have a number of them, but I do want to note to my friend, Mr. Huffman, that your witness just said that sequestration's an option.
And we'll go to
Yield back.
Mr. Huffman for 5 minutes. You're recognized.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. I want to commend you for trying to have a serious conversation about how agriculture and our food supply can be part of the climate solution, how we can build a more affordable and resilient food supply chain. So just for those maybe watching this hearing, this is not another rerun of the I Love Oil show. We see that rerun all the time around here. We're trying to talk about food security and resilience, and the piece of this that I'm most interested in is food waste. And for those of our witnesses who work in this field, I just want to tell you, I think your work is so important. I want to make sure you know that it is appreciated. And I would think food waste could be just something we would find common cause on. It seems like such an obvious thing to tackle together. It's a huge contributor to climate change. A report by the EPA found that annual greenhouse gas emissions of food loss and waste alone equals that of 42 coal-fired power plants. The annual water and energy used in food waste is enough to supply 50 million homes. So why would we not want to tackle this together? Use our food better, reduce waste, and improve food security. And by the way, there's a lot of methane involved in that food waste. And if we care about inflation, addressing food waste actually saves families money. So it is a win on so many levels. Ms. Gunders, I want to ask you for some ideas for how Congress can tackle this issue. What are some thoughts about how we in Congress can invest upstream to try to reduce food waste?
Thank you so much. And absolutely, I think it is a solution to the increasing prices that we're seeing today. You know, even several studies have shown that lower income households and higher income households actually waste approximately the same percentage of their food budgets. And so helping those folks, especially in lower incomes, stretch those food budgets is a really important component, especially today. And that's where really focusing on consumer food waste is an important place to focus, such as a national consumer campaign that really helps educate consumers, gives them the tools to stretch those food budgets. Another place further upstream is creating a national public-private partnership. There's a really successful start to a public-private partnership on the West Coast right now. We have 7 retail signatories, including Walmart, Kroger, Albertsons, some of the largest, who are participating and working pre-competitively to identify opportunities. And taking that type of partnership national can really expand the potential. They're piloting all sorts of new projects. They're sharing learnings. They're looking at specific sectors like dairy and produce and how can they reduce waste, through the manufacturer, even in production, all the way through to retail. And so really looking at some of those partnerships is critical, and funding a national one would be a key step. Another is looking at opportunities in schools. There are things that can be done, such as share tables being put out all around the country. Share tables are popping up where students who don't want their food can put it on a table, and those who would like more or to take some home are able to take that food. Simple solutions like that can be elegant. Another are milk dispensers. So instead of putting milk in little cartons, it can be in a dispenser, and those students who care for milk can take what they would like, and those who don't have to just take the carton and put it straight into the garbage. Lastly, I think waste is often a locally governed or jurisdicted issue. And so really providing funding to local and state jurisdictions to explore policies in this area, to fund technical assistance, food waste prevention programming can be a great solution as well.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And in the time that I have left, let me just respond to the suggestion earlier that by promoting healthier school lunches, Michelle Obama somehow contributed to food waste because 1 million kids stopped eating their school lunches. Let's be clear. If Michelle Obama had endorsed Twinkies, Fox News and right-wing media would have promptly declared that Twinkies are yucky, and 1 million people would have stopped eating them because that's what their parents and Fox News told them to do. I have seen in my district and in my state and around the country that healthy food can also be yummy food. And so I hope we can dispose of that canard and get back to the subject of healthy, nutritious food and reducing food waste and having a more resilient food system. So thanks. I yield back.
Great. And next we'll go to Ms. Escobar. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and many thanks to our panelists who are here today, both in person and virtually. Really grateful to all of you for your work. Food is a really critical component of the effort to tackle the climate crisis. And so, Madam Chair, thank you for bringing us back to focus on really practical solutions and ideas around food. And I think too many Americans don't realize the power of their decisions as consumers and the impact that those decisions have on the climate crisis and the climate emergency. Our country wastes between 30 to 40% of the food supply. This is not just immoral, but it is devastating to the environment. I do applaud communities and people across the country who are working to change that. In my own home district of El Paso, Texas, we've seen a rise in urban farms, such as Fossil Face Farms, helping tackle food insecurity in our community and helping educate the community by showing individuals how to farm and garden effectively at a low cost. There are also local organizations such as No Lost Food that provides meals to families in need by also focusing on reducing the food waste that goes into our landfills. Congress has to do more, but we have to support not just the local urban farmers, agricultural organizations, and ranchers who face climate-related risks to the food supply chain, but we also have to do everything possible to legislate around that and educate the public as well. Ms. Gunders, I have a couple of questions for you. Actually, I have one question for you. Can you please talk a little bit more about the importance of adopting existing technologies to reduce food waste and what Congress must do to encourage food waste technology innovation?
Absolutely. There is an explosion of innovation right now happening around food waste reduction, and some of it is incredibly successful. So we're seeing things like using big data and machine learning to improve forecasting for retailers, using new types of imaging and technical vision to evaluate the quality of products, using sensors to evaluate how much temperature exposure has happened, and allowing companies to route products that have a shorter life to places that are closer, and that have a longer life to places that are further. There is a ton of technology popping up, and yet it is taking some time to innovate and to be adopted. And so certainly incentives that would help both create more incentives for R&D and innovation, as well as for early deployment and adoption of some of the technologies that are proven, would be hugely impactful.
Well, I agree. I think those incentives are really important so that we can ensure that there's an urgency to that innovation, and we get it into the marketplace as quickly as possible. I have a question for Ellie Brown. Ensuring that families have affordable and healthy foods is crucial, especially in economically disadvantaged communities like my own. Not having healthy options leads to health risks and environmental impacts that affect the most vulnerable. Can you please explain the importance of improving community food environments, especially in economically disadvantaged communities, and what policies, specifically what federal policies, are necessary to ensure that food environments improve?
Yeah, thank you for this question. Really, the reality is that our current dominant food system, that is one that is very top-down, fuels chronic disease. And most of the folks that live in communities where they are struggling do have issues around accessing healthy food. Some folks call it food deserts or food apartheid. But ultimately, really reclaiming the type of food that's available in these communities, like you mentioned, urban farming, this is a movement for communities in terms of their own power to reclaim their food system and food sovereignty. So really what's important ultimately is a more community-driven food system, more community-governed food system. But in the short term, we could do everything that we have in our government toolkit to support these communities, from economic incentives, of course, public assistance dollars that really help match resources to flow into the local food economy. We've seen a lot of great things happen, from EBT matching at farmers markets, different programs that exist around incentives for that, and grants, really, to really support grassroots organizations in their access to these grants that are available. We often are trying to navigate the system with grassroots organizations. It really is hard to get these resources to flow into communities. So in the short term, there's a lot of tools that we could be using for government to support more access to healthy food. However, in the long term, we need to really shift the power so communities can really decide for themselves the type of food environment they'd like to see.
Thank you so much. I'm out of time. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Well, thank you very much. And I agree with you. This has been it's a hearing that we intended to focus on those practical solutions. And we know with the escalating climate crisis, higher temperatures, the higher energy and food cost, the food system can provide a lot of those solutions. And I want to thank our witnesses for helping us today. Ms. Gunders, you've been very clear on the call to action. Thank you. You've now given us some practical solutions on food labeling, how we fund and empower public-private partnerships. Ms. Brown, I've been impressed with what you're doing in San Diego for many years on reimagining and reconfiguring the food system. But as Ms. Gunders said, the innovative technologies are exciting, but we need action right away. And one of the solutions I think we need to add to the list and talk about is preventing the conversion of cropland. I see it in Florida as population growth and other stressors try to expand into critical areas. You want food and and everything produced nearby. So, Ms. Gunders, what's the most important right now policy at the federal level to ensure that we're more efficient on the cropland we have now and we don't continue to convert that cropland to other uses?
Sorry. Yes, I think there are a few. One is supporting the North American Grasslands Conservation Act. There's already a great program called the Sod Saver that's been part of Farm Bills in the past. That expanding this program could reduce negative impacts of that happen out there. And then also rethinking renewable fuel standards and policies is the other. And I would point you towards a report that's been written on this by the World Wildlife Fund, who are really kind of the experts on the policy around this.
And Dr. Sepp, you focused on this as well, and I do appreciate how you pointed out early that our farmers and producers need help. I met with farmers in Florida not too long ago across all industries, citrus, cattle, dairy, the plant nurseries, the specialty crops, and they are hungry for help because their productivity is suffering under extreme temperatures, extreme rainfall events. So what do you point out to us are the most important policies that we need to be focused on to help our farmers and to conserve cropland?
Yes, thank you for the question. I'd like to come back to just a few points that, frankly, I think apply a lot across a lot of different landscapes in the producer community that you're talking with, right? Whether they're row crop producers, cattle producers, they're thinking about orchard or private timber stands. And that is, we already have an existing suite of federal and state conservation programs that producers know, they're familiar with. There are recommendations about how to improve, streamline those, make them more accessible, make them more equitable, but also those programs are already heavily oversubscribed, right? Just the one example that I gave earlier, in a single year, $1.1 billion in one program of interested but unfunded applications. And those are producers coming in, they've already done the research, they have a proposal, they've submitted it for a competitive review process. So when we think about how we can scale up the action of now, right, like scale up sustainable agriculture and forestry practices across landscapes across the country, it really is about helping meet producers where they are with what they need when it's technical assistance and cost share for practice implementation. And then I would say also recognizing the value of the private marketplace. So that's back to the opportunity around some of those market-based conservation signals to really think about how those can connect and tie in with increased revenue and share of profit for producers.
Thank you very much. And Ms. Brown, San Diego, the alliance there can be a model for other communities across the country, but I'm worried there are many communities that simply don't have the resources to implement that kind of local grassroots effort. What can we be doing to encourage that model and empowering people at the local level across the country?
Yeah, you'd be surprised. Johns Hopkins facilitates a food policy network nationally, and I know several years ago there was at least 250 organizations in various different communities across the nation, city level, county level, state level, really organizing around food policy, very bottom-up, grassroots approach. So you'd be surprised. A lot of folks are really getting together around this issue. I think it really crosses political lines. Food is a necessity. We want to support our local farmers. We want to support our local businesses. How do we do that together? So there's a lot of groups out there. You just really have to listen.
Thank you very much. Next, I see Mr. Crenshaw has joined us virtually. Mr. Crenshaw, you are recognized for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the ranking member for holding this hearing. And look, listening to the testimony, there are some real pragmatic ideas here on how to reduce food waste and improve farming practices. And I'm sure there's a lot of space for bipartisan legislation there. But like many of these hearings, what we also hear is these good ideas crowded out by more radical ideas that end up hurting Americans, especially on their most basic needs, energy and food. And it is worth pointing out some of the other countries very recently that have taken these radical approaches. Sri Lanka banned pesticides, herbicides, and other chemicals that provide crop protection. That was because of their environmentalist lobby. They're currently in a devastating humanitarian crisis because they have not been able to produce enough food to eat. Don't worry, because Sri Lanka has a near perfect ESG score of 98. I'm sure that makes them feel good. Environmental groups sued the Netherlands into enforcing a limitation on carbon emissions in their country. Now, the Netherlands is bound by their Supreme Court into enforcing this, and it started enforcing bans on agricultural emissions. To meet that goal, the Prime Minister said the only way they can do it is to cut cattle by 30%. So you can imagine what's going on in their country right now as there is an uprising and a potential food shortage. In the United States, the EPA has said that the Supreme Court won't stop them from pursuing hardline emission targets for industry, which suggests that the EPA is going to try to use a little-known authority called Section 115 of the Clean Air Act to enforce the emissions targets set out in the Paris Climate Agreement and potentially put us on the same track as the Netherlands and Sri Lanka. When it comes to crop protection and the EPA, the crops going unharvested lead to an increase of both carbon and methane emissions, and they often go unharvested because of damage caused by pests and disease. The EPA is restricting crop protection products, restricting natural gas production for fertilizer, constraining the production of chlorine through restrictions on both of the ways we produce chlorine, and restricting the use of several other commonly used herbicides and pesticides. But Ms. Gunders, this question is for you. Without immediately available, affordable crop protection products, do you anticipate that farmers increase the number of unharvested products?
I apologize that I'm not super familiar with various crop protection laws or regulations, but I do.
You don't need to be. I mean, just to be clear, I mean, it's a basic question. If you don't have the materials necessary to fend off pests, then do you think you're going to have more unharvested products in the fields, which is a concern of yours, of course?
I do believe that crop protection plays a role in protecting crops, and therefore, yes, certainly saving crops from pests can help lead to more harvest.
And you've indicated that crop waste leads to higher carbon emissions. You make a good argument for that. So these products would be good and helpful in reducing carbon emissions overall. Would you agree with that? I'm not trying to trick you here. I promise you. I know that's what it feels like.
I do believe that a certain level of crop protection can help lead to full utilization of crops that are grown.
Thank you. And on the subject of food prices, these actions that I've been talking about are increasing costs for Americans. And I want us to continue what we know how to do. And we know how to do this actually pretty well in this country. Pursue environmental goals and promote human flourishing at the same time. We can protect people while also producing enough food and energy for Americans. I truly believe that, and I yield back. Thank you.
Great. Well, I'd like to thank our witnesses for your testimony today on how we build a climate-smart food system and lower costs for our neighbors and lower pollution from farm to fork and build a more sustainable food supply chain. Without objection, I'd like to enter into the record a July 15th, 2022 letter from the Biotechnology Innovation Organization in favor of investments and policies supporting agricultural innovation as a climate solution that helps farmers and ranchers be resilient in a changing world. And without objection, all members will have 10 business days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses. I ask our witnesses to respond as promptly as you're able. Thanks again, everyone, for joining our Climate Smart Solutions from Farm to Fork hearing today. The meeting is adjourned.